Okay, let's unpack this. When we talk about making sure AI is beneficial, a lot of the conversation seems to circle around this idea of alignment.
Right. Getting AI to agree with, like a single set of human values.
Yeah, almost like there's one right answer we're all supposed to find, but
Yeah.
what if our fundamental disagreements, those clashes in beliefs, what we hold dear?
What if they aren't just mistakes?
Exactly. What if they aren't just errors to be corrected? What if they're actually a basic part of being human, something we need to navigate, maybe manage, but not eliminate entirely?
That's really the core question, isn't it? And it's explored brilliantly in the paper we're digging into today. It's called Societal and Technological Progress as Sewing an Ever-Growing, Ever-Changing Patchy and Polychrome Quilt.
Quite a title.
It is. And for this deep dive, we're looking at excerpts from this really fascinating piece of research.
Right. And for you listening, whether you're maybe thinking about AI ethics at work or trying to understand why society seems so, well, divided sometimes.
Or maybe you just love exploring new ideas.
Yeah. This discussion offers a, surprisingly useful way to look at these really complicated issues. It's less about finding their simple fixes.
And more about grasping a different path forward, maybe a more realistic one.
We hope it gives you some real, aha moments.
So the core argument of the paper, and this is what makes it so interesting, is that instead of trying to build one single aligned AI,
Or get everyone in society to agree perfectly.
right, we should probably focus more on building practical social technologies. Think of them as the tools, the systems we use to get along.
To handle the disagreements that just pop up naturally in diverse societies.
Exactly. And that metaphor in the title is key. Society is this constantly evolving patchwork quilt.
Okay, so our goal today is to really get into this appropriateness framework for AI safety and, well, for how we coexist in society, as the paper puts it.
We want to explore the main ideas, figure out what they mean for us.
And maybe even challenge some of the ways we currently think about all this stuff.
Okay, so where do we start? Let's look at something the paper calls the Axiom of Rational Convergence.
Right, the convergence idea.
Yeah, it's a pretty common thought, especially in some communities focused on AI alignment. It suggests that if rational beings just have enough time, enough information,
And can reason perfectly.
oh, they'll eventually all agree on the same beliefs, the same values. They'll converge on the truth.
The paper mentions groups like Less Wrong and some early work by Yudkowsky back in 2004 as places where this idea gets talked about a lot.
Yeah.
Okay, so the basic idea is disagreements are temporary. It's like if we all just had the same facts and could think without any biases, we'd see eye to eye.
That's the gist of it.
But the paper is a bit skeptical about this, right?
Yeah.
It suggests maybe we shouldn't just accept this axiom without question.
Precisely. They make a really neat comparison, actually. They relate it to the parallel postulate in geometry.
Oh, interesting. How so?
Well, you know how choosing a different version of that postulate leads to totally different kinds of geometry, like Euclidean flat geometry versus curved non-Euclidean geometry.
Yeah, completely different systems, but internally consistent.
Exactly. So the authors argue that choosing not to accept this axiom of rational convergence, well, it leads to a fundamentally different way of thinking about AI alignment, about ethics, about right and wrong. It opens up a whole different viewpoint.
Okay. So if we don't just assume we're all marching towards one ultimate truth, how does that change how we see things like morality? The paper digs into whether we can really separate facts from opinions here, right? Bringing in thinkers like Walser and Rorty.
Yeah, it's fascinating. The paper questions if we can really draw a sharp line between fact and opinion, especially when it comes to morals. They point out that, as we grow up, we learn these general moral principles that seem pretty universal. Walter calls this thin morality.
Like don't murder.
Right. But we also learn much more specific ethical rules that vary a lot between cultures of the thick morality and what's often cognitively opaque, as they put it.
Meaning we can't easily see it.
Yeah, we can't easily tell if a moral belief we hold is one of those universal things or if it's just specific to our group, our culture. It makes you wonder, how do we know if some social rule is genuinely critical for cooperation or just, a quirk of our particular patch on the quilt? Especially since breaking either one might get you into trouble socially.
That really makes you think about all those unspoken rules we follow. And the paper goes further, doesn't it? Suggesting even what we think of as objective facts are shaped by our cultural context.
Exactly. The argument is that even our epistemic norms, the standards we use to decide what counts as good evidence, how we justify our beliefs, even those are culturally specific. They mentioned research on causally opaque cultural knowledge. This shows that people often rely on knowledge passed down through their culture without fully understanding why it works. Think about traditional farming techniques or something.
Right, you just do it because that's how it's done and it works.
Precisely. And if that's true for basic survival skills, the paper argues it's likely even more true for the complex rules governing cooperation in modern societies. The implication is that culture evolves in ways that aren't just about rational debate leading to some final truth.
Okay, so if we ditch this idea of everyone eventually agreeing through pure reason, what's the alternative picture? How does society actually work and make progress?
Yeah.
This brings us back to Rorty's metaphor, the polychrome quilt.
Yes. If we don't buy the axiom of rational convergence, we need a new mental model for society. And the paper finds it in Rorty's idea of this quilt. Instead of everyone converging, human societies are more like collections of diverse communities.
Different patches on the quilt.
Exactly. Each with its own distinct values, norms, ways of seeing things.
Yeah.
And what holds this whole quilt together isn't some shared set of fundamental beliefs.
It's the stitches.
It's the stitches, the social conventions, the institutions, the practical ways we figured out how to live side by side.
So each community is like its own patch, with its own rules, its own expectations. The paper mentions thinkers like Beccari, Ostrom, Ullmann Margulis here.
Exactly. Within those patches, maybe it's a workplace with its own culture or a social group with unspoken rules. Members generally know the norms, know what happens if they step out of line.
Makes sense.
But these community-specific norms, they don't always stay neatly within their patch, do they? They often sort of bleed outwards, and that's where you get friction.
At the boundaries between the patches, where different communities meet.
Right. We're talking about those everyday conflicts.
Yeah.
The paper gives some really good examples, like a business owner whose religious beliefs impact who they serve.
Or disagreements about environmental regulations.
What should be allowed on social media? Indigenous land rights. It really shows how one group's norms can clash directly with another's.
So what's the key takeaway here for social stability?
Well, what's crucial, the paper argues, is that a stable society doesn't necessarily resolve these underlying value differences. Instead, it develops ways to manage these boundary conflicts non-violently.
Like courts, legislatures.
Exactly. Legal systems, political processes, negotiation, compromise. It's when these mechanisms for handling conflict break down that social stability is really threatened, not just because people disagree fundamentally.
Got it. So it's not about everyone agreeing, but about having the right tools, the social technologies to deal with disagreements when they happen. The paper uses this term for things like conventions, norms, institutions.
Yes, those are the social technologies. They're the tools society uses to organize itself and handle conflict.
So like traffic laws.
Traffic laws, property rights systems, legal procedures, how scientific peer review works. These are all examples. They let us coordinate and cooperate even when our basic beliefs might be totally different. The paper nods to thinkers like Hadfield, Weingast, North, Ostrom here.
And these stitches, these social technologies, they work for different reasons, right? It's not always because everyone deeply believes in them.
That's a really key insight. Stability doesn't always come from shared values. Sometimes it's because people see the system as legitimate, even if they dislike a specific outcome.
Like accepting a court ruling you disagree with because you believe in the legal process overall.
Right. Or it could be coercion obeying laws you don't like because you fear the penalty.
Yeah.
Practical self-interest is huge. Two powerful groups might uphold a system because it benefits them.
And sometimes it's just inertia.
Sometimes it's just inertia. That's how things have always been done. The paper brings in ideas from people like Lessig, Sunstein, Marwell, Oliver, Gintis on these points. The main thing is these mechanisms let us coexist without needing everyone to agree on values first.
So the focus shifts. It moves away from this maybe impossible goal of getting everyone to agree on values.
To the much more practical goal of resolving conflicts and letting different groups, even those with incompatible values, live together.
It's about having those agreed-upon ways of handling disputes, and maybe a general sense that some extreme actions just aren't okay because they threaten the whole system.
Exactly. The paper emphasizes how these procedural norms and condemning extreme acts within a political system kind of act as a safeguard for pluralism itself, even if, how those norms get applied is always being debated and isn't perfect.
This whole quilt idea, focusing on managing disagreement, it really changes how we should think about AI safety, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It leads to a pretty fundamental shift in the questions we should be asking.
Instead of the usual, how do we align AI with human values? which kind of assumes there is a single set of values.
Right, a single target to aim for.
The paper suggests we should be asking the more fundamental question humans have always grappled with. How can we live together?
And that immediately acknowledges the reality, the persistence of deep disagreement.
It's the difference between, like, chasing that clear vision of something true and deep, as Rorty put it.
And the more practical, down-to-earth task of just sewing together all these diverse pieces.
The paper talks about why this pursuit of a clearer vision, this idea of mistake theory, is so appealing, especially in AI alignment circles.
Well, the appeal is strong, isn't it? Mistake theory suggests disagreements, even about really basic values, are essentially just errors.
Mistakes.
Yeah, they come from cognitive biases or not having enough information, things like that. And the idea is if we could just fix those errors, maybe with super smart AI helping us, we'd all converge on the right answers.
It assumes there's an underlying truth out there, a single right way to reason, a coherent set of values, just waiting for us to find it.
Exactly.
And this belief really shapes a lot of AI alignment thinking, doesn't it? The paper brings up coherent extrapolated volition, CEV, as a prime example.
Yes, CEV, as Yudkowsky proposed it, really embodies this mistake theory approach. It imagines this idealized process, humans thinking deeply, resolving all their internal contradictions.
And arriving at one clear, unified goal for AI.
Right. Even if we don't know what that goal is yet, the assumption is that this idealized state represents a truer version of human values than the messy, conflicting preferences we actually have. Disagreements are just noise to be filtered out.
So ideas like creating an ideal observer or reaching a reflective equilibrium, these are all different attempts to get at that clearer vision by refining or correcting our flawed human judgment.
Precisely. And the emphasis you sometimes see on formal logic, on very abstract reasoning in parts of the AI community, that often comes from the same belief, this hope of accessing objective truths directly.
Even concerns about things like instrumental convergence.
The idea that different AIs might develop similar bad sub-goals, like power-seeking.
Right. That often motivates the search for a single, really robustly good objective function, grounded in that clearer vision as like a universal safety net. Anything less feels risky from that perspective.
Yeah, you can see the logic.
But the paper champions this alternative view, conflict theory. It draws on thinkers like Mouffe, March, and Olson, using the term maybe a bit more broadly than just in political science.
Exactly. Conflict theory, in this wider sense, sees disagreement not just as noise, but as a fundamental, often unavoidable feature of the social world. Differences aren't just mistakes. They often come from genuinely different interests, different values, rooted in different ways of life.
So expecting everyone to converge on one clearer vision is, well, unlikely based on history.
And maybe not even desirable, the paper suggests. Progress becomes less about discovering some pre-existing truth and more about the ongoing practical work of building social structures, those stitches again that let different groups coexist and cooperate despite their differences.
Okay, so the paper argues that chasing the single clearer vision for AI might actually create some blind spots and limitations. What are the potential dangers here?
Well, one key area is the assumption that there's just one single best way to reason.
Ah,
The paper points out that what counts as a good reason, or convincing evidence, actually varies quite a bit across societies, even across different scientific fields sometimes. They talk about locally effective epistemic norms.
meaning what works as justification in one context might not in another?
Exactly. What looks like flawed reasoning from the outside might be perfectly valid within a specific community or tradition. So ensuring AI safety might need more than just logical consistency by one standard. It might need AI to understand and navigate different ways of thinking.
That's a really interesting point. Another concern the paper raises is about relying too heavily on these very long, abstract arguments in AI safety discussions.
Yes, the fragility of long abstract arguments. While those complex chains of reasoning are valuable for exploring flexibilities, they can be really sensitive to your starting assumptions.
A small change at the beginning could lead to a totally different conclusion way down the line.
Right. And they can be hard to verify independently, prone to hidden errors, maybe even influenced by our own motivated reasoning without us realizing it. The further these arguments get from concrete, real-world evidence, the less reliable they might become.
And harder for people outside that specific conversation to really grasp and buy into.
Exactly.
Then there's the challenge of achieving shared goals, like reducing existential risk from AI X risk. The paper talks about the startup problem and the free rider problem.
Right. Even with a goal that sounds universal, like Let's prevent human extinction.
Seems straightforward enough.
But the moment you try to define what that means in practice, you immediately run into value judgments. What are we willing to sacrifice now? What parts of human life are essential? What future are we even aiming for?
Which makes getting everyone on the same page incredibly difficult. That's the startup problem.
That's the startup problem. Mobilizing collective action is hard when the goal itself involves these deep value questions. And then the free rider problem makes it worse.
People benefiting without contributing.
Exactly. Even if a collective AI safety effort gets going, there's an incentive for individual actors, companies, countries to benefit from the safety measures without paying the costs or doing the work themselves, which can mean we end up with too little safety overall.
And finally, the paper says mistake theory can be very solipsistic. What do they mean by that?
They mean that assuming everyone who disagrees with you is just mistaken. Well, it might feel comforting personally, maybe makes you feel sure you're right.
But it's not a great basis for understanding how groups actually work together or how governance functions, where disagreement is just normal.
Right. Relying too much on mistake theory risks creating a kind of echo chamber, underestimating how crucial institutions and social norms are for actually managing conflict in the real world. It's like thinking your own perspective is the only rational one for making decisions that affect everyone.
Okay, so if we step back from mistake theory, embrace this conflict theory view, how do we actually build safe and beneficial AI? It comes back to those stitches, right? The social technologies.
Exactly. Conflict theory emphasizes that stability in diverse societies comes from these practical tools, the norms, the institutions that help us manage conflict and cooperate even when we disagree. Power is distributed, not concentrated.
Which creates incentives for groups to compromise, to find ways to work together.
Yes, the shared understanding of what's appropriate behavior in a given situation that becomes the key. Appropriateness covers conventions, norms, institutions.
And appropriateness is totally dependent on the context, isn't it? The paper uses the example of a legislature.
Perfect example. People with fundamentally opposing political views can still, hopefully, debate and pass laws because they follow agreed-upon rules of procedure.
They don't have to agree on the issues, just on the appropriate way to conduct themselves in that setting rules for debate, voting, compromise.
Precisely. And when we think about risks like AI seeking power, the paper argues the danger isn't just the AI's drive, but the possibility of any single entity, human or AI, getting so much power it destabilizes the whole system.
So the focus shifts. It's less about trying to program don't seek power into the AI.
And more about designing robust governance systems, having multiple centers of power, polycentric institutions as Ostrom called them, that can check and balance each other.
This connects back to Walzer's thick versus thin morality idea we touched on earlier. How does appropriateness fit in there?
Well, remember, thick morality is the rich, detailed, culturally specific stuff, while thin morality tries for universal principles.
Right.
The paper argues that any attempt to just program supposedly neutral, thin ethics into AI will inevitably end up smuggling in assumptions from some specific, thick moral tradition. You can't really escape the cultural context.
So recognizing that is crucial. Ethical guidance for AI needs to deal with the messy reality of values, not try to impose one decontextualized framework.
Exactly. Which brings us squarely to context-dependent appropriateness when integrating AI. The paper contrasts a tech support AI with a comedy writing assistant.
A great illustration.
Because what's appropriate is totally different. A slightly edgy joke might be fine, even good, from the comedy bot, depending on the user.
But completely inappropriate from tech support.
Right. The paper argues AI failures are often context-inappropriate behavior, not necessarily a violation of some grand universal value.
And a big challenge now is that AI often lacks that deep background knowledge, the understanding of social cues that humans just absorb.
Which leads to that default blandness we often see.
Very safe, very generic.
And often functionally useless. It lacks the nuance, the empathy, the creativity needed for so many tasks.
Which leads to the idea that maybe we don't want one giant, universally appropriate AI.
Perhaps a decentralized ecosystem of specialized AIs is better. Systems tailored for specific context.
The paper actually lays out 4 design principles for this appropriateness framework. Can you walk us through those?
Sure. First is contextual grounding. AI needs access to rich contextual info location, social roles, current events, cultural norms, you name it.
Okay.
Second, community customization. Different communities should be able to shape the norms governing the AI they use, tailor it to their needs and values.
Makes sense.
Third, Continual adaptation. AI has to learn and adjust constantly based on feedback from its interactions as social norms themselves evolve.
It can't be static.
No. And fourth, polycentric governance.
Yeah.
Decisions about what's appropriate AI behavior shouldn't be made by one central authority. It needs to be distributed among multiple stakeholders.
Now, that third point, continual adaptation through feedback, that raises the manipulation question, doesn't it? Could AI be trained on bad feedback?
It's a critical concern, absolutely. The paper stresses the need for really robust, decentralized feedback mechanisms, ones that ideally get stronger against manipulation over time, not weaker. It's a design challenge for sure, building in checks and balances.
And what about the underlying tech? What kind of architecture supports this?
The paper suggests something that allows for specialization and decentralization, maybe using big foundation models as a base.
Which have some general capabilities and maybe some core safety training.
Exactly. And then downstream developers can customize and fine-tune them for specific contexts, teaching them the relevant appropriateness for that niche.
And finally, privacy. All this contextual grounding sounds like it needs a lot of data, potentially sensitive data.
Yeah, the paper acknowledges that directly. It emphasizes that context-aware AI must come with strong technical and policy solutions for privacy.
Like?
Things like privacy-preserving machine learning, on-device processing, secure enclaves, clear data governance rules, maybe drawing on ideas like Nissenbaum's contextual integrity framework to ensure data use is appropriate for the context in which it was shared.
Okay, so this whole framework, this vision of the quilt held together by these practical stitches, it's not just about minimizing conflict, is it?
No, it's aiming higher. It's about creating conditions for collective flourishing. When we have shared understandings of appropriateness, it creates stability, predictability.
Which frees up energy for innovation, for progress.
Exactly. By focusing on managing conflict, not eliminating disagreement, we can collectively work on adding new, vibrant patches to the quilt.
And the paper tackles the worry about this just being relativism head on, right?
It does. It argues that while specific norms vary, the social technologies themselves, the ways we manage coexistence, can be studied rigorously. The goal isn't to say anything goes, but to find practical ways to prevent destructive conflict, not impose one universal morality.
It contrasts the astronomer, looking for objective truth and universal alignment.
With the tailor, who pragmatically sews together diverse pieces using social technologies. It's a call to move from chasing maybe illusory certainty to doing the practical work of integration and conflict management.
And the paper ends by reminding us that, well, human history shows we do manage to coexist despite fundamental disagreements, not by resolving them all.
Exactly. It suggests the AI alignment community could learn a lot from how multicultural societies have actually managed to function, often quite successfully, over long periods.
The universe doesn't guarantee us coherence, as they say.
And human values aren't necessarily destined to converge. Recognizing that might be the first, most crucial step. Our history shows we can thrive.
Rational convergence embraced this really powerful image of society as a patchwork quilt.
We've shifted the focus from perfect alignment to understanding appropriateness in context.
And highlighted the vital role of these social technologies, the stitches, and helping us navigate the disagreements that are just part of life.
Hopefully this deep dive has given you, the listener, some fresh ways to think about these really complex issues, whether it's AI ethics, societal challenges, or just curiosity.
It's really a move away from seeking that single right answer, isn't it? Towards understanding how we build systems, human and artificial, that can actually function, maybe even flourish, in a world full of different viewpoints.
Yeah, this deep dive really pushes us to re-examine some core assumptions about alignment, about progress. Instead of chasing that perfect unified vision, maybe the more effective, more realistic path is understanding and strengthening the messy, practical mechanisms that let us coexist